There's such a good first reading. I think it bears some attention. So it's the call of Samuel. Oftentimes the criticism we'll hear about ourselves as Catholics versus Protestants is we don't know our Old Testament. So today I'm going to focus just on the call of Samuel so that we can beef up our Old Testament knowledge and understanding of this. So I want to talk a little bit about who Samuel was, just very briefly, then focus in and go deep on this first call story, or the call story from the first reading, and then I want to pull out 3 lessons that are practical for our lives. So who is this Samuel person? He was born by Hannah and Elkanah. Now, their names necessarily aren't that important, but the important thing is that they couldn't have children. And so Hannah went and prayed, and she made a deal with God. If you bless us with a child, I'll give him back to you. Bring him back to the temple, offer him to you in service out of thanksgiving. And in fact, the word Samuel, the name Samuel, means God hears. So God heard her prayers, so she gave him that name of Samuel. And now this idea of giving a child back to the temple for service, to become maybe a priest and things like that, to serve God in this way, it's not too unfamiliar. I'm half French-Canadian, and for the longest time, the eldest boy would be offered back. You know, when they had 8 and 12 kids in the families, well, the first boy, or at least one of the boys, would be considered, or they'd encourage them to become a priest. So it wasn't that long ago that we continued that same tradition of giving the first fruits, but also as thanks for God's blessings of children, to give one back to serve the Lord. So that's how Samuel finds himself now in the temple as a boy. He was sleeping in the temple. He was a young boy at this time. So that's how we encounter Samuel right now, as a young boy. And Samuel will become one of the great figures in Israel. He has a great role. He became a priest, a prophet, a judge, and he played the important role of naming and anointing the first 2 kings of Israel, Saul and David. So that's a pretty important role that Samuel played. And so all this time God was preparing him, and this call story that we heard is this beginning of his mission. So his call from a young boy is the beginning of his encounter with God, his response to God, and ultimately the great things that he is called to do in his life. So let's look at this call story. It's kind of funny when we hear it, and I encourage you to take some time to look it up again, maybe in some spare time this week. I find it hilarious because God's calling him, and it's a Samuel, Samuel, exclamation mark. So I don't know if it was God shouting or if God is speaking emphatically, but clearly he's speaking to Samuel with a strong tone. Samuel, over here. And so Samuel, as a young boy, they said in the first reading, has not encountered the Lord, does not have a relationship yet with the Lord. He didn't know who it was, so he went to the prophet Eli, who's in the temple with him, and he thinks it's him calling him, I guess, to do something else. Like, Samuel, come on over here, we need some help. So he rushes over and says, I'm here, you called. And Eli, obviously that wasn't his call, it was God speaking to him. He says, I didn't call you, go back, lay down. You just go back and take a nap. And then sure enough, it happens 2 and 3 times again. So could you imagine this repetition happening? Eli, dumb little boy or something like that, he's like, what's going on? But Samuel is hearing the Lord, and it isn't until Eli clues in and realizes, wait a minute, this isn't something wrong with the child. God is speaking to him. Eli, of course, a great prophet at the time, the current time, he's realizing and seeing how God called him in Samuel and saying, wow, God has chosen Samuel to follow in my footsteps, and sure enough, he does. So he introduces God to Samuel, saying, this is the Lord speaking to you. And that is when everything changes, when someone introduces the Lord, introduces God to a child. That first encounter, the child, now Samuel, his ears are open, his heart is open, his eyes are open. Okay, this is going to be the Lord speaking to me. And even though he's in close proximity, again, the Ark of the Covenant is right here in this temple at Shiloh where he's living, where Samuel, Eli, everybody's living at the temple, where the Jews believe that God resides. Even though he's in that close proximity, he didn't know God because he's a young boy. So it isn't until Eli says, this is the Lord calling to you. So when he calls next time, this is how you are to respond. Speak, Lord, your servant is listening. So Eli teaches Samuel how to respond to God, how to understand God speaking to him. And sure enough, God is persistent. God is patient, and he calls Samuel a fourth time. He could have easily said, okay, this kid's not listening to me, I'm going to try someone else for this design. But God isn't like that. He said, no, I chose him for this special mission, this vocation in life, and I will be patient with him. And so there's lots of lessons that we can learn from this call story of Samuel. We can learn, I pulled out just 3, but there's lots of different things. 3 things. The first is that we need a relationship with God to recognize his voice when he speaks to us in our hearts. We need a relationship with God to recognize that voice of God speaking to us in our hearts, in our lives. Because without that relationship, we won't recognize it. Just like Samuel thought it was Eli, we may think it's something else. We may think it's, who knows what we think it is, but we may think that it's something else or someone else. Or we may ignore it as, oh, I'm going crazy. God can't speak to me. But absolutely, God wants to speak to us, and he's patient with us, persistent with us in his desire to communicate with us. And so we see that, again, in our own lives. And I'll use a personal story. We're told not to share too many personal stories, but I'll tell you one of when I was an infant. Apparently, at the time in the hospital, the nurses were quite amazed, and obviously people in our family and friends that saw me as an infant. Whenever my dad would say my name, Matthew, Matthew, my eyes would go big and I'd look around, where's Dad? Where's my father? No one else could do it, not even my mom, but when my dad said it, I recognized his voice, I had a relationship with him. And that's mainly, I believe, because he talked to me in my mother's womb for the 9 months before I was born. And so I knew that voice. It was one of comfort, one that was close, one that was special to me. I had that relationship established. So then whenever I heard my father speak to me as a child, right away I knew who it was. I had that relationship. And so too it is with Samuel. Once his eyes are open to this is the Lord, begin your relationship with him. His eyes are open and he responds, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. And that's the same for us. Once we develop that relationship with God over weeks, months, years in our life, when the Lord speaks to us, boom, our eyes will be open, our heart will be open. Speak, Lord, your servant is listening. This is an important moment in my life. And so it's important that we develop that relationship with God if we are to hear him speak to us. The second lesson or thing that we can glean from Samuel's call story is that God is patient with us in our response, and he's persistent in seeking out that relationship with him. So he calls Samuel 4 times. Again, he was very patient with that. Again, I said he could choose someone else. He could try his luck with another person who may respond the first time. But so too, we have to recognize God's call in our life and understand that he is patient with us. Sometimes we may think, well, I missed the boat, or maybe that was the Lord speaking, or I lost that opportunity. No. The Lord is persistent. If he has a design on our life, if he wants us to do something, if he wants to move us in a direction, introduce us to someone, or open up this door in our life, he will be persistent and patient with us. So that's an important thing to know, that God is patient with us in our response for that relationship, but also he's persistent in it. And I'd like to use an example of loneliness to explain God's patience and persistence. Many spiritual writers have talked about what loneliness is, that loneliness is the soul crying out to God, seeking that relationship with him. The soul is separated from God, and that it just seeks God. It aches to be with God. And so many spiritual writers have talked about loneliness in this way. And again, I've talked to many people, and time and time again, it doesn't matter if people are single or married, we all experience loneliness. If you're young, if you're old, experience loneliness. If you're alone by yourself or surrounded with people, in a restaurant or in a stadium, you can experience loneliness. You could be sitting here and experience loneliness. And it's that call of the soul back to its Creator, because we are made in the image and likeness of God, and only God can satisfy that call. And so it's in a way God's homing beacon. If we turn our faces or our backs to the Lord, and the way we live, or ignoring his voice speaking to us, he's going to call us back. And that comes through, one of the ways that it comes through, again, many Christian spiritual writers spoke about loneliness calling us back, as reminding us of that natural desire to receive the love from God, that relationship with God, which is the only way that satisfies our hearts. And we turn to all sorts of different things to fill this void. Again, it could be possessions, it could be, I don't know, shopping, traveling, doing different things to fill up that void. But we realize in a hurry that only God will satisfy that call, homing beacon. And that is why God is persistent. He's persistent because he's reminding us, come back to me, have a relationship with me, experience my love. And that is the love, that relationship that will fill that loneliness. So loneliness is a reminder that God is patient with us, but also calling us into relationship with him. The third lesson that we can learn from the call of Samuel is how we should approach the Lord in prayer. Many of us, myself included sometimes, will go and we'll come in with our laundry list or our shopping list. Lord, can you do this? Can you fix this person? Can you tell this person to be quiet or leave me alone? Or you come asking for things. Can you heal this problem? Can you do that? And we're asking. And we hear Eli, when he introduces Samuel to the Lord, he says, the way you will respond is, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. Listen. We need to listen in our prayer life. We need to listen because God is speaking to us. Just like he spoke to Samuel 4 times. Samuel, Samuel. We need to listen. So he's calling us by name too. Listen, I want to speak to you. And so we have to come from that place of humility, but also of openness to receive that message that God wishes to give to us. And we need to look at him and say, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. Rather than, listen, Lord, for your servant is speaking right now. We're called to speak, to listen. And so today we heard a little bit about who Samuel was, where he came from. It's important to get to know who these people are in our faith tradition. But also we looked at his call story and how that impacts our lives, the importance of having a relationship with God so that we can hear and recognize his voice, and then to respond to that voice with generosity in our lives, with whatever call that may be, whatever God may be asking us to do, and that we are called to respond to God with ears that are open and attentive to what he has to tell us.